The last message from the desert arrived with the sterile, almost imperceptible ping of a satellite connecting to a device miles above the Earth. It was a modern miracle, this ability to pluck a signal from the heart of the wilderness, and for Chloe, Jenna Dillinger's younger sister, it was a profound source of comfort. Her sister, 7 months pregnant and camping with her husband, Marcus, in the vast, primitive expanse of Joshua Tree National Park, was still reachable. That connection felt like a tether, a silver thread stretching across the hundreds of miles that separated them, assuring her that all was well. The photo that materialized on Chloe's phone screen was pure, unadulterated joy. Jenna, her face radiant and fuller than Chloe had ever seen it, her belly a perfect round curve beneath a royal blue sweater, was seated on a camp chair before a small lime green tent. Behind her, her husband Marcus knelt, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders, a wide, happy grin splitting his bearded face. His eyes, even in the pixelated image, crinkled with an expression of deep contentment. The image was a perfect capsule of their excitement, a final adventure for two before their world was forever and beautifully changed by the arrival of their first child. A text message followed moments later, a simple, happy declaration, all set up for the night. The desert is beautiful. Love you. Chloe had smiled, her heart swelling with a familiar mix of love and sisterly concern. She replied instantly, her thumbs flying across the screen, sending a string of heart emojis and a gentle, almost maternal reminder for Jenna to stay hydrated and not overdo it. Then she had gone about her evening, preparing for bed with the comforting image of the happy couple etched in her mind. She pictured them sitting by a crackling fire, the flames dancing against the deepening twilight, the immense, star-dusted canopy of the desert sky arching above them. That was yesterday. Now, the afternoon sun of the following day was casting long, intrusive shadows across her living room floor, and the silence from Joshua Tree had metastasized. It had grown from a peaceful, expected quiet into something deeply unsettling. They had a plan, a simple one born of Chloe's persistent, loving worry. Jenna, knowing her sister's tendency to fret, had promised to call by noon, just a quick, all is well, to soothe Chloe's anxiety about her being so heavily pregnant while sleeping on the ground, even with the comfortable backup of their new custom-outfitted camper van parked nearby. But noon had come and gone without a sound. At first, Chloe had rationalized it away with practiced ease. They were on vacation after all. Maybe they slept in, lulled into a deep slumber by the profound quiet of the desert. Maybe they'd gone for a short, leisurely hike and lost track of time, captivated by a blooming cactus or a shy desert tortoise. The satellite messaging system, a Starlink they just installed, was new. Perhaps it was finicky, its connection to the heavens as temperamental as a toddler. But as 1 p.m. stretched into 3 o'clock, and 3 o'clock began to bleed into the late afternoon hours of 5 o'clock, the rationalizations wore thin, their comforting fabric fraying to reveal the cold, creeping dread underneath. She called Jenna's phone. The call went straight to voicemail, not even a single ring piercing the digital void. She immediately tried Marcus. The same sterile, immediate result. Her heart began to beat a little faster, a frantic bird trapped in her chest. She pulled up the photo on her phone again. The image that had brought her such joy just 24 hours ago now looked like a ghost. The smile seemed frozen, forced. The vast, beautiful desert landscape behind them now appeared menacing, its open spaces not a symbol of freedom but of a terrifying, swallowing emptiness. The white camper van, a symbol of their safety and meticulous preparedness, was just a silent, impassive box in the background. Every detail that had been so reassuring yesterday was now a source of mounting terror. Why hadn't they packed up and left as planned? Why hadn't they at least driven the van to a town with a reliable cell signal to make their promised call? The questions began to circle in her mind, a carousel of darkening thoughts, each one more frightening than the last. Had Jenna gone into early labor? Had there been a medical emergency? A fall? An accident? By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, the knot of fear in her stomach was too tight to ignore, too painful to rationalize away. Her hands trembling slightly, she opened her laptop and looked up the non-emergency number for the National Park Service dispatch at Joshua Tree. Her voice was surprisingly steady as she explained the situation to the calm, professional man on the other end of the line. She laid out the facts. A 37-year-old woman, 7 months pregnant, and her 42-year-old husband, now more than 5 hours overdue for a critical check-in. She forwarded the photo, the last proof of life, and described their vehicle in detail. A white 2010 Ram ProMaster camper van. The ranger on the phone was reassuring, his tone practiced and calm, but the underlying procedure was clear. This was now a priority. As the last light of day faded from the sky, 2 park rangers were dispatched, their headlights cutting a lonely, searching path into the immense, encroaching darkness of the park. The rangers, a veteran named Alistair and a younger, sharper ranger named Ben, knew the general area the Dillingers favored. It was a semi-secluded spot in the northern section of the park, away from the bustling main campgrounds, a place for people who sought genuine solitude. It took them nearly an hour of driving, first on the smooth ribbon of paved roads and then on the washboard vibrations of graded dirt tracks, before they saw it. Bathed in the stark, clinical white of their vehicle's powerful searchlight, the scene looked exactly like the photograph Chloe had sent. The white camper van was parked on a level patch of gravelly ground, about 30 feet from the small one-lane track. The lime green tent stood taut against the gentle night breeze, its color an alien splash against the muted tones of the desert. It was a perfect, peaceful tableau frozen in time. As the rangers stepped out of their truck, their boots crunching on the gravelly sand, the silence was absolute. It was a physical presence, a weight on the ears. There was no flicker of a campfire, no murmur of conversation, not even the rustle of animals in the nearby creosote bushes. "Mr. Dillinger? Mrs. Dillinger?" Alistair called out, his voice strong but seemingly swallowed by the immense, indifferent space. The only reply was the soft whisper of the wind. They began a slow, deliberate circle of the campsite. 2 camp chairs were angled toward a cold and used fire pit. A small bag of firewood sat untouched beside it. The flap of the lime green tent was zipped tightly shut. Ben shone his powerful flashlight inside, revealing 2 empty sleeping bags, neatly laid out, their pillows fluffed as if waiting for their owners to return. They tried the doors of the camper van, all locked. Everything was in its place, tidy, expectant, and utterly silent. It was as if the occupants had simply woken up at dawn and evaporated into the dry desert air, leaving behind a perfectly preserved diorama of their last happy night. Within hours, the campsite transformed from a place of eerie silence into a full-blown crime scene. The soft glow of dawn revealed the stark artificiality of yellow police tape, cordoning off the area against the ancient, twisted landscape of Joshua trees and granite boulders. The initial park rangers had given way to a larger contingent of county sheriff's deputies and a specialized team of investigators. The entire scene was bathed in the cold, analytical light of official procedure. Their first priority was gaining access to the locked camper van, which sat like a sealed metal tomb in the center of the unfolding drama. Rather than break a window and risk contaminating potential evidence, the lead detective, a man named Frank Garrison whose face was a roadmap of long years spent investigating crimes in these vast, empty spaces, made the call to bring in a locksmith. It was a decision rooted in the fragile hope of preserving every single shred of potential evidence. As the locksmith from a nearby desert town meticulously worked on the ProMaster's lock, Detective Garrison surveyed the scene with a growing sense of unease. Everything was too perfect. In his long and varied experience, when people went missing in the wilderness, their campsites were often a chaotic mess, a clear sign of a hasty departure, a medical emergency, a struggle, or an animal attack. This was different. This was sterile. It felt staged, unnaturally tidy. The sharp, metallic click of the van's lock finally breaking the morning silence was jarring. The side door slid open with a smooth, almost silent sigh, revealing the interior. The investigators, led by Garrison, peered inside, and the profound mystery of the scene only intensified. The small, custom-built living space was immaculate. A bed in the back was neatly made, the duvet smoothed out. On a small kitchenette counter, a half-empty bag of trail mix was clipped shut with a clothespin. A reusable water bottle was full. And there, placed carefully side by side on the small counter, were Marcus and Jenna Dillinger's wallets. An investigator wearing latex gloves carefully opened them. Inside was a substantial amount of cash, all their credit cards and their driver's licenses. Next to the wallets lay a secondary cell phone, an older, non-smartphone model they likely kept for emergencies. And beside that, a poignant and heartbreaking symbol of the life that was supposed to be, a bottle of Jenna's prenatal vitamins. The discovery of the wallets and phone was a critical, game-changing turning point. People who choose to disappear to start a new life, to escape their past, take their money and their identification. People who get lost or injured on a hike would almost certainly have their wallets on them. And no one, absolutely no one, would willingly leave their pregnant wife's essential medication behind. The scene screamed a single, undeniable fact. Whatever had happened to the Dillingers, it had not been planned by them. They had fully, unequivocally intended to return to this van. The only things missing from this perfectly preserved tableau were the couple themselves, the clothes on their backs, and the primary smartphone that had sent that final happy photograph. The lack of any sign of a struggle inside the van was just as perplexing. There were no overturned items, no scuff marks on the floor, no trace of violence or panic. It was as if they had been called out of the van in the middle of the night and had simply walked away, leaving the entire infrastructure of their lives locked securely behind them. As search and rescue teams began the arduous process of a grid search of the surrounding desert, a grim and often fruitless task in the unforgiving, canyon-scarred terrain of Joshua Tree, the investigative team turned their focus away from the empty landscape and toward the digital and financial lives of Marcus and Jenna Dillinger. On the surface, they were the picture of a happy, stable couple. Jenna was a beloved and respected elementary school teacher, currently on a year's leave for her pregnancy. Marcus was described by friends and family as a friendly, outgoing man, a self-employed business consultant who absolutely doted on his wife. Their joint finances were healthy, their social media presence filled with smiling photos and positive messages. Their life appeared as orderly and untroubled as the interior of their camper. But in any major investigation, the surface is just the starting point. The first crack in that perfect facade appeared 2 days into the investigation. A financial crimes detective, tasked with a deep and thorough dive into their accounts, found something that the standard credit reports had missed. While their shared bank accounts and credit cards were in good standing, Marcus Dillinger had another hidden financial life. He was carrying a staggering amount of private debt, sourced not from banks, but from high-interest hard money lenders. It was the kind of debt a person takes on when they are desperate, when they can no longer secure conventional loans. According to the payment schedules the detective uncovered, Marcus was on the verge of defaulting on several of these loans. This discovery changed everything. Suddenly, Marcus Dillinger wasn't just a missing person. He was a man under immense, secret financial pressure. He had a powerful, classic motive to escape his life. The question that hung heavy and unspoken in the air of the detective's office was chilling. Was that motive powerful enough for him to discard his pregnant wife? The theory began to crystallize, and it was an ugly one. Perhaps the baby moon camping trip was a ruse. Perhaps Marcus, seeing no way out of his impending financial ruin, had concocted a desperate, monstrous plan. This grim hypothesis gained terrifying momentum when a new lead came in. A bolo, be on the lookout, had been issued for Marcus. A gas station attendant, working the graveyard shift in a dusty, forgotten town over 100 miles from the park, called the tip line. He remembered seeing a man who matched Marcus's photograph. The man had come in 2 nights after the Dillingers were last heard from. He had seemed jumpy and agitated, the attendant recalled, his eyes constantly scanning the empty parking lot. He had paid for gas with a wad of crumpled bills pulled from his pocket, bought a prepaid burner phone, and most tellingly, a detailed paper road atlas of the American Southwest. The attendant remembered the atlas specifically because it was such an old-fashioned, unusual purchase in the age of GPS. The man had avoided all eye contact, his shoulders hunched, and he had left in a hurry. The attendant couldn't be 100% positive it was Marcus Dillinger, but the resemblance was strong. For Detective Garrison and his team, this was the missing piece that seemed to lock the entire puzzle into place. A man with a secret, crippling debt. A wife who had likely just discovered the extent of his deception. A remote, isolated location. And now, a credible sighting of the husband, alone, buying the exact tools a fugitive would need to disappear off the grid. The narrative wrote itself, a classic story of domestic noir. An argument in the desert over the hidden debt turned violent, then deadly. Marcus, in a panic, hides his wife's body in the vast, unforgiving wilderness and flees, using his 2-day head start to begin a new life as a wanted man. The hardest part of the job was delivering this devastating news to the family. Detective Garrison met with Chloe at her home. He laid out the facts as neutrally and gently as he could, the discovery of the staggering debt, the credible sighting at the gas station. He watched as the fragile hope that had sustained her for days curdled into disbelief, then into a raw volcanic fury. She shot to her feet, her face flushed with an anger born of love and deep conviction. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm, "absolutely not. Not Marcus." She began to pace her living room, her movements agitated. She told the detective about how Marcus had spent weeks, painstakingly building the baby's crib by hand from reclaimed oak. She described how he would read to Jenna's belly every single night, his deep voice a gentle rumble against her skin. She told him how Marcus had cried with pure, unadulterated joy when they saw the first fuzzy black and white image of their child on the ultrasound screen. He wasn't a man running from his life, she insisted. He was a man running toward it with open arms. You're wrong, she said, tears of frustration and grief now streaming down her face. He would die for her. He would never ever hurt her. He is a victim just like she is. In that moment, in that grief-stricken living room, two irreconcilable stories were born. For the police, Marcus Dillinger was now a fugitive and their prime suspect, the sole focus of their investigation. For his family, he was another missing person, a victim, and the police were wasting precious, irreplaceable time chasing a ghost. The initial frantic energy of the search for Marcus and Jenna Dillinger inevitably slowed, then stalled and finally, like a desert mirage, dissipated altogether. The seasons turned over Joshua Tree National Park. The fierce, unrelenting heat of summer baked the ground where the couple's lime green tent once stood, followed by the crisp, cold nights of winter that brought a dusting of snow to the highest elevations. The yellow crime scene tape was long gone, and nature, with its slow, persistent patience, had reclaimed the small patch of cleared earth, leaving no trace that a life-altering tragedy had begun there. In the county sheriff's department, the thick manila folder labeled Dillinger was moved from the top of the active investigations pile to a drawer, and eventually to a shelf in the cavernous, dusty records room. It was now officially a cold case, a silent testament to a decade of dead ends and unanswered questions. For the public, the story of the missing couple faded from the news cycle, replaced by newer, more immediate tragedies and scandals. But for Chloe, time offered no such relief. Every passing day was a fresh wound, a renewal of the agonizing uncertainty. She fought tirelessly, a lone warrior against the encroaching silence. She built a website, managed a Facebook page, and hounded the lead detective for updates that never came. She refused to accept the official narrative. The image of Marcus as a fugitive killer was a fiction, a lazy and convenient conclusion drawn by investigators who couldn't be bothered to look for a more complex, more difficult truth. She would point to the complete and total lack of evidence that he was even alive. In the years that followed their disappearance, not a single one of Marcus's credit cards was ever used. His social security number never appeared on any payroll in any state. No credible sightings ever materialized after that initial, shaky report from the gas station attendant. He had not contacted a single friend or family member. He had vanished as completely and utterly as Jenna had. A ghost who left no footprints in the world. To Chloe, this wasn't the behavior of a cunning, successful fugitive. It was the profound, unending silence of a dead man. The years stretched into a quiet, agonizing limbo. 2012 became 2013, then 2014. Detective Garrison retired, taking the institutional memory of the case's early days with him. New sheriffs were elected, new priorities set. The Dillinger case became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered to tourists about the dangers of the desert. But for law enforcement, it was a frustrating monument to failure, a cold case that mocked them from its shelf in the records room. Then, in the late summer of 2017, nearly 6 years after the couple disappeared, a mundane bureaucratic decision forced the case back into the light. The Dillingers' camper van, which had sat in the county impound lot accruing dust, grime and storage fees, was scheduled to be released. It was a final, painful piece of administrative housekeeping. Chloe, as the next of kin, had been notified to arrange for its collection. Before the vehicle could be released, however, department policy dictated a final, thorough inventory. It was a thankless, routine task that fell to a young, meticulous deputy named Ken Morales, who had only been a rookie when the Dillinger case first broke. The impound lot was a desolate place, a vehicle graveyard where every car, truck, and van was a chapter in a story of misfortune or malice. The Dillinger van sat in a back row, its white paint now dull and streaked with grime from years of neglect. Deputy Morales unlocked it, the air inside stale and superheated from the desert sun. He began his methodical work, clipboard in hand, checking off the items listed on the original evidence manifest from 2011. Sleeping bags, camp stove, first aid kit. It was all there, a perfect time capsule from that last fateful night. He worked his way through the small living space, noting the condition of the custom-built cabinetry that Marcus, a skilled amateur woodworker, had installed himself. As he ran a gloved hand along a bank of overhead storage bins, his fingers detected a subtle imperfection. One of the vertical seams between two of the cabinets didn't feel right. It was almost too perfect, lacking the tiny uniform gap that should have been there. It was flush, seamless. Curious, he pushed on it. It didn't budge. He tapped it with his knuckle. The sound was different from the surrounding panels, not the solid thud of wood but a hollow, resonant echo. His pulse quickened slightly. This wasn't on any inventory sheet. This was something new. He retrieved a multi-tool from his belt and carefully worked the thin, flathead screwdriver bit into the hairline crack of the seam. With a gentle twist, a hidden magnetic latch released, and the panel popped open with a soft, satisfying click, revealing a dark, rectangular cavity. The deputy shone his flashlight into the hidden compartment. He wasn't sure what he expected to find. A weapon? A stash of cash? A confessional letter? It was none of those things. Inside, lying diagonally, was a single object. A gray, cylindrical, waterproof map tube, the kind a serious architect or engineer might use. It was completely sealed. He carefully removed the tube, his mind racing. This was not the work of a man in a panic. This was careful concealment. This was premeditation. Back at the station, the discovery sent a jolt of electricity through the cold case unit. The tube was unsealed in a sterile evidence room. A senior detective, a veteran who remembered the initial frustration of the case, carefully slid out the contents. It wasn't one map but a series of them tightly rolled together. As they were unfurled on a large table, it was clear these were not standard tourist maps of Joshua Tree. They were highly detailed, professional-grade geological surveys. They depicted a specific remote sector of the park, an area far from any established trails or campgrounds, known for its rugged terrain, abandoned mines and complex rock formations. But it was the handwritten annotations that truly baffled the investigators. The maps were covered in small, neat, handwritten notes in pencil. They were cryptic technical references, pegmatite dikes prominent, check alluvium for float, and strings of coordinates followed by notations like possible monazite. This was not the language of a hiker. This was the language of a prospector. The discovery completely shattered the established, long-held theory of the case. The man seen buying a simple road atlas at a gas station was a red herring, a ghost. The real Marcus Dillinger, it now seemed, was engaged in something far more complex and secretive than a simple family vacation. Had he been an illegal prospector? Was he meeting someone out in the desert for a clandestine deal that had gone wrong? The investigators pursued the new lead with a renewed, short-lived vigor. They brought in a geology professor from a nearby university to examine the maps. He confirmed the notes pertained to the search for valuable rare earth minerals, but called the annotations sophisticated amateurism. They were knowledgeable, he said, but lacked the precision of a professional survey. The detectives tried to trace the origin of the custom-printed maps, but the small company that had produced them had gone out of business years ago, its records lost to time. They organized a targeted search of the area marked on the maps, but it was a vast, unforgiving landscape of canyons and rock fields. Without a more specific target, the search was hopeless and was called off after 3 frustrating days. The maps were a bombshell that failed to explode. They provided a tantalizing, profound glimpse into Marcus Dillinger's secret activities but offered no clear path forward for the investigation. The clue was both profound and useless. It didn't prove his innocence, but it made the long-standing theory of his guilt seem simplistic and deeply unlikely. It suggested a deeper, more dangerous game was being played, but gave no indication of the other players. The Dillinger case file was updated one last time. The geological maps were photographed, logged, and sealed in an evidence bag. The file, now thicker and more mysterious than ever, was placed back on the shelf in the records room. The case was colder than ever, now haunted by the ghost of a clue that no one knew how to solve. For 11 years the desert kept its secret. The relentless sun bleached the landscape, the seasonal winds shifted the sands, and the memory of the missing couple from Joshua Tree faded into the realm of cold, dusty files. The world moved on. Chloe's hair began to show threads of gray. New detectives filled the ranks of the sheriff's department. Life for everyone but the Dillingers continued. October of 2022 was no different from any other autumn in the park. The air was dry, the sky a brilliant, cloudless, and indifferent blue. It was under this vast sky that a man named Derek Vinson, a software engineer from Seattle seeking a brief escape from the perpetual gray drizzle of the Pacific Northwest, decided to venture off the beaten path. He was an experienced hiker, drawn to the profound solitude of the park's less traveled corners, finding a certain peace in the stark alien beauty of the geology. He wasn't following a trail, just his own curiosity, navigating by the position of the sun and the shape of the distant rock formations. The call of nature came upon him suddenly and unapologetically. Looking around, he saw no one for miles in any direction. He spotted a large, weathered cluster of granite boulders that would offer a bit of privacy and began walking toward it. As he rounded the corner of the largest rock, his eyes scanned the ground for a suitable spot, and he stopped. Something was out of place. In a small, shallow depression, the sandy soil was clearly disturbed. It was loose and churned up, littered with the kind of debris that suggested recent animal activity, most likely a coyote digging for a rodent or a kit fox expanding its den. It was a common enough sight, but something about this particular spot held his attention. In the center of the disturbed earth, he saw a glint of white, not the bright, clean white of bleached rock, but a dull, off-white, almost yellowish color. His first thought was that it was a piece of trash, perhaps a discarded plastic container, and he felt a flash of annoyance at the thought of careless visitors leaving their rubbish behind, even out here in the deep wilderness. Driven by a mix of curiosity and a hiker's ingrained leave no trace ethic, he stepped closer. The white object was partially buried, curved in a way that seemed strangely, eerily familiar. He nudged it with the toe of his sturdy hiking boot, expecting it to be a light piece of plastic or perhaps a sun-baked bone from a bighorn sheep. The object didn't just move, the sand around it crumbled away, revealing more of its shape. And in that instant, the world tilted on its axis for Derek Vinson. It wasn't one bone. It was a series of them, fused together in a horrifyingly, undeniably recognizable pattern. The curve he had seen was the elegant, arching shape of a human rib. He was looking at a human rib cage. He stumbled back, a gasp of cold air catching in his throat. His heart hammered against his own ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden, profound silence of the desert. He looked again, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. But it was undeniably real. He could see the distinct, parallel lines of individual ribs emerging from the sand. He scrambled for his phone, his fingers fumbling, clumsy with a sudden, sickening rush of adrenaline. He stabbed at the screen, dialing 911. The voice of the dispatcher was a calm, grounding presence in his swirling panic. 911, what is your emergency? I found something, Derek stammered, his voice thin and reedy, a stranger's voice. A body? I think. Bones. Human bones. The dispatcher's tone remained level, professional. Okay, sir, can you tell me your location? Derek looked around wildly, the familiar, beautiful landscape now feeling alien and deeply threatening. He tried to describe his position, referencing the sun, the shape of the boulder formation, the direction he'd walked from the nearest dirt road. He could hear the clicking of a keyboard on the other end of the line as the dispatcher worked to pinpoint his coordinates. The process felt like an eternity. He was told to stay put, not to touch anything, and that units were on their way. After he hung up, he sat on a rock a good 50 feet away from the site, his back to it, unable to look again. He just stared out at the empty desert, the image of the rib cage burned into his mind like a photographic negative. Within the hour, the silence was broken by the distant sound of approaching vehicles. 2 park rangers arrived first, their faces grim and professional as Derek recounted his discovery. They confirmed the remains were human and immediately established a wide perimeter, their yellow tape a stark, brutal declaration that this patch of wilderness was now a crime scene. The initial rangers were soon joined by sheriff's deputies, and most importantly, the county's forensic investigation unit. The lead forensic archaeologist, a woman with sun-weathered skin and eyes that had seen more than most, directed the operation with a quiet, practiced authority. This was not a recovery, it was an excavation. The process was painstaking, methodical, almost reverent. Her team set up a grid system over the shallow grave. They didn't use shovels, they used trowels, dental picks, and soft bristled brushes. With the delicate precision of surgeons, they began to remove the layers of sand and soil, one grain at a time. As the afternoon wore on, the full extent of the burial was revealed. The skeleton was remarkably complete, preserved by the dry desert air. It was positioned in a seated, almost fetal position, with the knees drawn up toward the chest. The skull was intact, its empty eye sockets staring out at a world that had moved on without them for more than a decade. It was the skeleton of an adult female. As the team carefully brushed away the last of the sand from the abdominal and pelvic region, the lead archaeologist suddenly paused. She motioned for her colleague to look. There, nestled within the protective cradle of the female skeleton's pelvic bones, lay another, impossibly small and fragile skeleton. The tiny, delicate bones of a skull, a miniature rib cage, the thread-like bones of limbs. It was the perfectly formed skeleton of a fetus, lying exactly where it had been in its mother's womb. A hush fell over the entire team. Even the seasoned, hardened deputies looked away, a collective, unspoken wave of grief washing over the site. This wasn't just one victim. It was two. After 11 years of silence, buried under layers of sand and secrets, Jenna Dillinger and her unborn child had finally been found. The discovery of Jenna Dillinger's remains sent a seismic shockwave through the county sheriff's department. The Dillinger file, a cold case so dormant it was practically fossilized, was abruptly reactivated. This was no longer a missing persons case shadowed by the ambiguous possibility of a husband on the run. This was a homicide. The location of the grave, in a remote, almost inaccessible part of the park, immediately nullified the long-held theory that Marcus had killed his wife in a spontaneous fit of rage near their campsite and fled. This burial was deliberate, calculated, and required intimate knowledge of the park's hidden corners. The fugitive theory, which had guided the investigation for over a decade, evaporated under the harsh desert sun. The entire case had been reset to zero. A new task force was assembled, blending veteran detectives who remembered the original case with younger officers who brought fresh perspectives and familiarity with new forensic technologies. Their first and most critical task was a complete and total review of the mountain of old evidence. Detective Miles Corbin, a man nearing retirement who had been a junior officer back in 2011 and had always been haunted by the case, was assigned the painstaking job of rereading every report, every interview transcript, every dead-end lead in the original file. He spent 2 full days immersed in the case's long and frustrating history, the faded ink and typewritten pages a testament to a decade of failure. On the 3rd day he came across the supplemental report from 2017, the discovery of the hidden compartment in the camper van. He read the description of the waterproof tube and the geological maps found inside. He pulled up the digitized images of the maps on his computer, their surfaces covered in Marcus Dillinger's cryptic, handwritten notes. A jolt, like a surge of static electricity, went through him. He cross-referenced the GPS coordinates from the newly discovered grave site with the annotations on the maps. It was a perfect, undeniable match. The shallow pit where Jenna and her baby were found lay directly within a large hand-drawn circle on one of Marcus's surveys. The forgotten clue, the baffling discovery that had led nowhere 6 years prior, was suddenly the Rosetta Stone of the entire investigation. The maps weren't just a random curiosity, they were a direct, physical link between the victim and the precise place of her burial. Marcus Dillinger hadn't been a simple tourist. He had been drawn to that specific, desolate spot for a reason. The question was no longer if he was there, but why. While Corbin was connecting the dots of the past, the remains of Jenna and her child were undergoing a meticulous examination at the county medical examiner's office. The forensic anthropologist assigned to the case faced a formidable challenge. 11 years in the dry desert soil had erased all soft tissue, leaving only bone. Determining a precise cause of death would be difficult, if not impossible. A visual inspection revealed no obvious signs of trauma. No bullet holes in the skull, no nicks on the ribs from a knife blade, no spiral fractures indicative of a blunt force injury. The skeleton was a silent witness, its secrets locked away by time. Unwilling to give up, the anthropologist decided to employ a more advanced technique, scanning electron microscopy. The process involved taking microscopic samples from the surface of the bones to search for trace evidence that might have been left behind by a weapon or the environment of the attack itself. She focused on the cervical vertebrae, the bones of the neck, as they are often marked in cases of strangulation or other forms of asphyxiation. Under the immense magnification of the electron microscope, she found something. It wasn't a mark from a ligature, but something even stranger. Embedded in the porous, microscopic matrix of the bone surface were tiny, almost infinitesimal particles of a fine granular dust. The particles were metallic and unusually dense. They were not a naturally occurring component of the desert soil. This was a foreign substance introduced to the bone at or around the time of death. The discovery was highly unusual and deeply significant. The anthropologist carefully collected a sample of the trace particles and sent them to a specialized forensics lab with expertise in materials science and geology. The question was simple: what was this mysterious dust and where on earth did it come from? The investigation now had 2 powerful, converging lines of inquiry. The first was the map, which proved that the burial site was not random. It was a destination. This fact completely shifted the focus of the investigation. Detectives were no longer looking for a man who had run away from his life. They were looking for someone connected to that specific piece of land, someone who knew what Marcus Dillinger was doing out there. The second line of inquiry was the microscopic dust, a physical clue that held the potential to link a suspect directly to the victim's body. The task force pivoted. They set aside the old, dusty theories about marital strife and financial desperation. The key to this murder, they now believed, lay not in the Dillingers' personal lives, but in Marcus's secret professional one. They began the arduous process of reconstructing his business dealings from over a decade ago, pulling old corporate filings, tax records, and archived phone logs. They were no longer hunting for Marcus Dillinger. They were hunting for his associates. They were looking for the other player in the dangerous game that had led him and his pregnant wife to that desolate spot in the desert. The ghost of Marcus the fugitive was finally, definitively laid to rest, replaced by the image of Marcus the victim, a man who had stumbled upon a secret worth killing for. The new direction of the investigation felt like excavating an archaeological site of its own. Records from over a decade ago were archived, businesses had dissolved, people had moved on, and memories had faded. The detectives began by re-examining the crippling debt that had made Marcus Dillinger such an attractive suspect back in 2011. This time they didn't just look at the numbers, they looked at the names. They traced the origin of the high-interest loans and discovered they weren't from shadowy loan sharks, but were part of a complex and acrimonious business dissolution. The money Marcus owed was tied directly to the breakup of his consulting partnership. His former partner, a man named Leland Croft, had been the one to call in the debts, initiating a series of aggressive legal maneuvers just weeks before the Dillingers disappeared. Leland Croft. The name had appeared in the original case file, but only peripherally. He had been interviewed briefly in 2011, expressing shock and sadness over his former partner's disappearance. He had confirmed their business relationship was ending but had characterized it as a mutual, if somewhat tense, parting of ways. At the time, with the fugitive theory in full force, there had been no reason to look at him more closely. Now he was the center of everything. The investigators began to build a profile of Leland Croft, and as they dug, the pieces began to snap into place with an alarming clarity. They pulled his old credit card statements and public records. While his professional life was in business consulting, his personal passion, bordering on obsession, was geology. He had active subscriptions to obscure mining journals, receipts for rock tumblers and Geiger counters, and most tellingly, records of purchasing specialized geological survey software. Leland Croft wasn't just an amateur, he was a dedicated, knowledgeable prospector. The cryptic notes on Marcus's maps suddenly made perfect sense. They weren't Marcus's notes, they were likely Leland's, or at the very least they were written in his language. A new, chilling theory began to emerge, one that recontextualized every single element of the case. The consulting business, the task force now believed, was a front, or at the very least, Leland Croft was using its legitimate operations as a cover for his true passion: illegal prospecting for valuable rare earth minerals within the protected boundaries of Joshua Tree National Park. The partnership hadn't ended over simple business disagreements. It had ended because Marcus Dillinger, an honest man, had discovered what Leland was doing. The debt wasn't a sign of Marcus's financial failure. It was a weapon Leland was using against him in their dispute. The Baby Moon camping trip was now seen in a terrifying new light. It wasn't a final romantic getaway, it was a confrontation. Marcus, likely armed with copies of the maps and other evidence he had gathered, had gone to Joshua Tree not to relax, but to put a stop to Leland's operation. Perhaps he intended to gather final, irrefutable proof to turn over to the authorities. Or perhaps, more dangerously, he had arranged to meet Leland directly to confront him one last time in the very place where the illegal activity was happening. He had brought Jenna along, most likely under the continuing guise of the Baby Moon, never revealing the true, perilous nature of their trip. The camper van wasn't just for comfort. It was a mobile base of operations for a man who was about to blow the whistle on a secret enterprise worth a considerable amount of money. Leland Croft was no longer a person of interest, he was the prime suspect. The motive was clear and powerful: silencing Marcus to protect his lucrative, illegal operation. The investigators revisited the original sighting at the gas station, the one that had sent the investigation down the wrong path for 11 years. They pulled the grainy surveillance footage from 2011. The quality was poor, but with new digital enhancement software, they could clean it up. The man at the counter, the supposed fugitive, bore a definite, passing resemblance to Leland Croft. Same general build, same hairline. It was now sickeningly clear what had likely happened. Leland hadn't just killed the Dillingers, he had brilliantly and cynically orchestrated the aftermath. He had murdered his partner and the only witness, then driven miles away to a random gas station where he, a man who looked vaguely like Marcus, deliberately bought the items a fugitive would need. He had created a false trail, a perfect piece of misdirection that had successfully diverted all suspicion from himself for over a decade. He had not only committed the perfect crime but had framed a dead man for it. At the same time, the report from the specialized forensics lab came back. The mysterious dust found embedded in Jenna Dillinger's vertebrae was identified. It was thoughtite, a radioactive rare earth mineral. It was not something you just find anywhere. In fact, it's only found in commercially viable concentrations in a few places in North America. One of those places happened to be the exact isolated patch of desert where Leland Croft had been prospecting, and where Jenna's body was found. The pieces were all in place. They had the motive, the means, the opportunity, and now the forensic evidence to tie Leland Croft directly to the murder. After 11 years, it was time to bring him in. Leland Croft was now in his early 50s, a respected small-town business owner who ran a successful hardware store. He was a pillar of his community, a family man. When detectives Corbin and Morales knocked on his door, he was calm, cooperative, and projected an air of mild confusion. He agreed to come down to the station to answer a few questions about an old business associate. The interrogation room was cold and sterile. Leland sat opposite the two detectives, his posture relaxed, a look of patient helpfulness on his face. He was a fortress of calm. When the medical examiner inspected Jenna's remains, Corbin began, his voice low and steady. She found something unusual, a fine metallic dust embedded in the bones of her neck. He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. We sent a sample to the lab for analysis. The substance is called thothite, Leland. It's a radioactive rare earth mineral. It's not something you just find anywhere. Corbin leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. One of those places happens to be the exact isolated patch of desert where you were prospecting, and where we found Jenna's body. For the first time, a crack appeared in Leland Croft's fortress. It was barely perceptible, a slight tightening of the muscles in his jaw, a flicker of something cold and dark in his eyes. He tried to speak, but his voice was a dry rasp. Contamination. From the soil? It's a coincidence. The words were weak, lacking the confident authority he had projected moments before. The science was a wall he couldn't talk his way around. Before Leland could recover, Morales slid a second file across the table. He opened it to reveal two photographs side by side. This is what really changes things, Leland, the younger detective said, his tone sharp. We couldn't see this back in 2011. The technology wasn't there. But we reanalyzed the original crime scene photos from inside the camper van. He pointed to the first image, a digitally enhanced high-contrast picture of a faint, dusty footprint on the van's interior step. It was now shockingly clear. He then pointed to the second photo. This is the tread pattern from a pair of Red Wing geological boots, a specialized brand. Your preferred brand according to your credit card records from that time. They're a perfect match. Leland stared at the photographs. The thothite had placed him at the burial site. The boot print placed him inside the van. The two pieces of evidence were like the jaws of a vice, closing in on him from opposite sides. There was no more room for denial. There was nowhere left to run. The collapse was total. The calm, confident hardware store owner dissolved, replaced by a man drowning in a memory he had held underwater for 11 years. His shoulders slumped, the color drained from his face. He stared at his hands on the table as if they belonged to a stranger. A long, shuddering breath escaped his lips, a sound of profound and final defeat. He wasn't supposed to bring her, Leland whispered, the words tumbling out, thick with a decade of silence. He recounted the story in a broken, disjointed torrent. The meeting was his idea, a final, angry confrontation at his prospecting site. He was furious that Marcus was threatening to expose him. The argument escalated. Marcus was righteous, unbending. In a fit of pure, blinding rage, Leland had struck him with a heavy rock hammer he kept with his tools. Marcus went down and he didn't get up. And then he turned, and Jenna was standing there by the van, her hand over her mouth, her face a mask of pure horror. She had seen everything. I didn't have a choice, he choked out, the pathetic, classic excuse of a murderer. He described in cold detail how he had killed her, buried her in a prospect pit he had already dug, and then returned for Marcus's body, dumping it down the shaft of a nearby abandoned mine he knew of. The trip to the gas station was a final, cynical masterstroke of inspiration, a way to throw the police off his trail forever by framing the man he had just murdered. The interrogation room was silent, except for the sound of Leland Croft's ragged, sobbing breaths. The fortress had crumbled to dust. The case, after 11 years of agonizing mystery, was finally brutally closed. The confession of Leland Croft did not end the investigation. It launched its final, grim chapter. While Croft was processed and held without bail, a massive search operation was mobilized. Its focus now narrowed from the entirety of Joshua Tree National Park to a few square miles of rugged, mine-scarred badlands, the area Leland had described in his confession. The mission was no longer a search for a missing person, but a recovery operation. They needed to find Marcus Dillinger. The terrain was treacherous, dotted with the open mouths of abandoned mine shafts from a long-forgotten prospecting boom. These shafts were vertical tombs, some hundreds of feet deep, their wooden supports rotted and their edges unstable. Sending personnel down was deemed too dangerous. Instead, the task force brought in a specialized team from a state university's robotics lab. Their tools were a fleet of advanced remote-controlled drones, small enough to navigate the narrow shafts, equipped with high-intensity lights and high-resolution cameras. For 2 days, the operation unfolded under the relentless desert sun. The team worked methodically, moving from one abandoned mine to the next. The drone operators sat in the cool, air-conditioned darkness of a command vehicle, their faces illuminated by the green glow of their monitors, watching the live feed as the drones descended into the earth. The images sent back were claustrophobic and tense, rough-hewn rock walls, dangling roots, the occasional desiccated carcass of an animal that had fallen in. Shaft after shaft revealed nothing but darkness and debris. On the afternoon of the second day, a drone was lowered into a particularly deep and narrow shaft, one that Leland had marked on a map from memory. It descended past 50 feet, then 100. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the drone's powerful LED lights. At approximately 150 feet, the drone's camera tilted downwards, and the operator suddenly froze. At the very bottom of the shaft, tangled in a mess of discarded timber and rockfall, was a shape that was unmistakably human. The operator zoomed in, the camera lens adjusting to the darkness. The image sharpened, resolving into the chillingly clear sight of skeletal remains, clad in the tattered remnants of clothing. A quiet, somber confirmation was relayed over the radio. They had found him. A specialized recovery team, using a complex system of ropes and harnesses, was dispatched to the shaft. The painstaking process took several hours. Finally, as the sun began to set, casting long, purple shadows across the landscape, the remains of Marcus Dillinger were brought back to the surface for the first time in 11 years. Dental records provided a swift and certain identification. With the recovery of both victims, the story of their disappearance was finally complete. Leland Croft, facing an ironclad case built on his own confession and the irrefutable forensic evidence, was convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Chloe and the rest of her family, the verdict brought not joy, but a profound and aching sense of closure. The terrible weight of not knowing, which they had carried for more than a decade, was finally lifted. They could finally mourn. They could finally bring Jenna, Marcus, and the baby they never got to meet home. The desert had kept its secrets for 11 years, but in the end, it had given them back.